We're talking about the making of a city, viewed historically. And we've been talking about Chicago. Chicago, 228 square miles of real estate on the Illinois prairie. And we've looked at the first part of that history, which is really European history, right in the middle of the American context. Actually, let me put it this way. In the first 100 years of our national history as a country, the United States went west into the farms. What we're going to cover now is the second half of our history, when America went north into the cities. And it's interesting to notice that actually more people went north to the cities in the second half of our history after the Civil War, in the second half of our history in the 20th century, than went west to the farms in our first 100 years of our history. It's a very interesting observation that demographers make. Well, so far we've got a Chicago that looks like a human zoo that's emerging. The biggest piece of that is the poles, which came in around the edge. The Chicago fire of 1871 pushed beyond Western Avenue, which was the western boundary, and pushed it out so that whole new neighborhoods came into the picture. There was a little black community here from day one, and it was right down here next to the groups because they were the servants of those groups. They also had the first national newspaper, the Daily Defender. And because Chicago became the center of the railroads, all of the Pullman's cars carried the Defender to the ends of the train tracks in this country. So like the New York Times or USA Today, from 1845 on, the Chicago Defender was the first national newspaper. And that's how it happened. The Defender is published right behind the Quinn Chapel, which was the AME church in the heart of this little black community, the original black community. The Greeks came here, and I didn't mention much about them, but the Greeks had been conquered by the Turks. And they came to Chicago hardly knowing Greek, certainly not knowing any of their great history. They had been so badly treated. So many of these peoples that came were wounded. Some were not. Many were entrepreneurs. But they shape our country. And this is the way New York was built, and Detroit, and many other cities on the East Coast. And it moved west across the country. The cities in Texas, of course, and the cities in California had different histories. But settled by outsiders, settled by people who came to exploit the environment or the economy, these cities grew. After 1860, European Chicago led to a world war in 1914. One of the results of that war was America had it with Europe. And basically in 1925, passed the Locarno Act in Congress forbidding Europeans to come to this country. We had it. We wish we didn't have the Statue of Liberty. Our president said, let's get back to normalcy, and let's just stop trying to be world class. Let's just turn inward. About the same time, a new push factor occurred. The cotton gin had made mass production of cotton possible in the South. As you doubtless know, the Civil War was not, said Bruce Catton, about slavery in 1865. A background cause was two societies developing in contrary ways to the Industrial Revolution. According to Bruce Catton, Civil War historian, the war was inevitable in 1820. Two cultures, two widening cultures with little shared history. What happened then later is that the South mechanized 100 years later than the North. When that happened, we had surplus labor in the South came north. And so after 1918, the war ended, we returned to normalcy, we stopped taking these Europeans, but these cities were by now industrial machines. The steel mills were nearby, the Western traffic, the trains and later the planes required that these machines keep going. Southern labor came north. But that was not a neutral thing. The little black community started expanding south and then started expanding west later. And in 1917, actually, a kid was clubbed for swimming across an imaginary line on the lakefront, and we had the worst race riots that we've ever had in the city. And at that time, there was public housing emerging. Public housing had been a white thing. If you want to read a fascinating book about the history of American public housing, it's by Bowerly, Bowerly, called The Poor House. It points out that when public housing began, it really was a white thing. It was for poor whites, basically. And only late did it become an idea that blacks could have public housing. And just before the war, Eleanor Roosevelt marched in a parade to open the first public housing project in Chicago in 1942, for which she was promptly labeled a communist by the Chicago Tribune. Her communist sympathy was obvious. She was marching with the poor and celebrating the open housing, public housing, which up until then had only been for whites. Meanwhile, another thing happened after World War I happened. The city began to spread, and these people began to move out. And it's predictable where they move. They move in the direction of their cemeteries. It's very interesting. The Irish cemeteries are out here, so the Irish move this way. The Russian cemeteries are this Hinsdale, so the Russians tend to move that way. The Swede cemeteries are all up northwest, so they tend to move in that direction. It's not a surprise. They move in the direction of their cemeteries. And so the cities began to spread out and suburbanize. But what really made, and I'm going to fast forward, what really made this happen were the two things that happened after World War II. In World War II, 1945, we came back from defeating Germany. We realized that Germany could fight on both fronts because they had the Autobahns, a superhighway system. And so attached to a defense bill in the government in 1947, the U.S. government in the Truman administration put two pieces of legislation together. The first was the Federal Highway Act, and the second was the VA Mortgage Act. And these were put in a defense policy bill, and they were connected. The VA mortgage was going to be for all those in the social contract of America. This was a thank you to the troops who had served in the war. The assumption was, of course, the troops would be white. The VA mortgage was going to be white public housing, a subsidy for white folks to move out. And the highway bill was going to build interstate highways, 90% federally funded highways, that would demonstrate that the country was committed to get them to work. And so a number of things came together. Well, then the question came, well, now what are we going to do with black people? And we had that not in my backyard phenomenon emerge. So public housing almost overnight became black housing. And I will have to say candidly, a rather evil cabal of whites and blacks collaborated. Blacks like William Dawson, who was the House black for the mayors of Chicago and Franklin Roosevelt, the president, basically they didn't want the black vote scattered because it was a controlled vote. It could sway elections. So they were invested in keeping black people in the urban neighborhoods. Meanwhile, whites were glad to have blacks there, and they speculated in the real estate. And the expressways are not neutral. The Eisenhower Expressway in Chicago runs right straight west to the Republican DuPage County. So we named that expressway for a Republican national hero. It's our littlest expressway. So, of course, that's a Republican expressway because, you know, Chicago is a one-party place. Now, the important expressway in Chicago is the Kennedy, named for the Irish. And to show you what happened, the Irish expressway needed to go all the way out here to O'Hare, which is just on the edge of the city, the O'Hare Airport, another Irish name. When the Irish designed that expressway, they designed it to run right through the Mother Church of the Poles. St. Stanislaus, right down here, just on the near northwest side of the city. If you've ever come out of Chicago, you go under a bunch of concrete called Hubbard's Cave. You come out, and right in front of you is St. Stanislaus. You say, oh my Lord, we're going to go right through that church. That was the idea. The Irish were going to destroy the Poles. The Poles were 10 times larger than the Irish. The Irish were feeling threatened. You have to remember, Chicago was made up of the people who were killing each other in Europe in 2 world wars. And so ethnic politics is not a happy thing. Very often it's brutal. And so when the Irish could, they said, we're going to take down the Poles. Expressways are not neutral. 90% federally funded. Let's just drive that sucker right through St. Stanislaus Holy Mother Church. Now the Poles had never before invested politically. The biggest high water mark of the Poles in Chicago had been to change Crawford Avenue to Pulaski Street. But when they saw that the Irish were going to destroy Old Mother Church, they organized and they bent the Federal Expressway around the end of their building. If you drive there today, you'll notice it. It goes right around the end of the St. Stanislaus Church. It's the only time in the United States that has happened where a church, a local church, bent a federally funded interstate highway. Well, the Daley machine, Daley number 1, was so angry that they put immediately a black public housing project right in front of the daughter church. So if I were to give you a little history walk through that community, I would show you how they said, we'll get you for doing that. That is unforgivable. And they plopped down a black housing project right on 3 sides of the daughter church of St. Stanislaus to say, we're still in charge here. So the Kennedy Expressway goes to the important O'Hare Field. The Stevenson Expressway, of course, named for another Democrat who ran for governor, ran for president a couple times. But the biggest expressway in Chicago by far, and the busiest expressway in the entire world, is the Dan Ryan. 16 lanes, 2 trains run down it, and it runs down the side. Now, we know who Eisenhower is, kind of a national hero. We know who Kennedy is, another hero. We know who Stephen. Who in the world is Dan Ryan? And why is the biggest expressway in the world named for a guy named Dan Ryan? It illustrates something about ethnic politics. You see, the people who came from Europe never got to vote for people who became presidents. They were either kings by divine right or they were military. The only politics the ethics knew is local politics. So in ethnic Chicago and ethnic Detroit and ethnic Cleveland, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, it's upside down. The most important office is City Hall. Anybody can go on down there and be president of the United States. That's okay. But the important office is chairman of the King County Board or the Cook County Board or the Tarrant County Board, Dallas County Board. Those are the chief positions. We name our expressways after the people we value. Dan Ryan was chairman of the Cook County Board. And that expressway was made to keep the Irish on one side and the blacks on the other. One thing you need to know, expressways are not neutral. They were put through the centers of black communities in this country. If I were to take you on a tour of Miami, that Overton community was completely scuttled by expressways. And in this case, Cubans and others have done the job on the black church people. In Pittsburgh, you know, the hockey rink right downtown on the hill, that was the heart of the old black community. In center after center, interstate expressways were used to destroy black communities and then to divide other ethnic communities. It was a divide and conquer strategy. Originally, expressways were not to be part of cities. They were to be like autobahns, come up to the city and stop, as they do in Vancouver. There's no expressway going through Vancouver, British Columbia, unlike Toronto. You come right to the edge of the city and then you go through the arterial streets. That's the way they were supposed to work, just like they do in Germany. But the mayors figured out how to use this to destroy and divide and keep power and to destroy the black community. So we are not surprised that much of this fed the anger that became the long-delayed civil rights revolution. And so in the 50s and 60s, these cities became a cauldron of unshared history again, of explosive reality after the war. And you can see it, only patience in the black community kept it from happening long before this. But you can see why. The cities were now being run by the legacy of Europeans. And let's say the people on the front that I called the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or the wealthy, alienated, separated, and protected, they often brought in ethnic groups. The Mexicans were brought in and put here. Why? To destroy the unions that had emerged among these socialist people on the west side. You see, the people who came were often socialist. They had never even been democratic. So they organized the unions to express their political views as much as their economic views. And they were such a threat to the white ownership of the lakefront that they literally brought in Mexicans from the Southwest to destroy the labor unions. Now you can imagine how the Mexicans were viewed by these groups. So it became, in all of our cities in this country, a divide and conquer ethnic strategy. And I would have to tell you honestly, the churches were not very much involved in talking about this. We were playing our denial game. We were not looking at this picture very well. And the mainline churches that were called liberal or social. We just didn't address this very much. Now, in 1965, we did something in Congress for which I'm very proud. In 64 and 65, we passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the immigration law. When the immigration law changed, suddenly we had people coming from overseas now into our country. Only not so much from Europe as they had come before. In fact, almost no Europeans came. Instead, Latins came, and of course Asians came. And so Chicago has gone through now its fourth period. So let me walk you through it. The first phase of Chicago is national Chicago, people coming from the West Coast in, and then the Irish come. So the second phase is international Chicago. The third phase, international's cut off. The South comes north. It's national Chicago again. The fourth phase, we changed the immigration law, and now Chicago is international again, only it's no longer the Europeans, it's new Asians and Latin. You see, even though you have the same 228 square miles, you have this kaleidoscopic change taking place. The neighborhoods that used to be one thing are now something else. And it is very important that we understand that a city is dynamic. It keeps moving. The city reflects what's going on in the bigger world. You see? That's why we are calling this series Cities as Handbook, or Cities as Guidebook to the Nations. If you can understand how the city is moving, you'll be able to see basically the dynamics that are going on all over the world. So this is a Chicago history, but it's more than a Chicago history. I hope also something else has been modeled in this little exercise. I hope you see how much fun it is to be in a city like this. To do as I tried to do, learn a culture a year by going to their restaurants and their churches, walking around their neighborhoods. You see, I couldn't go to all those places, but I just had to go a few blocks, and I could be in those cultures. Urban ministry to me could never be a downer thing. You know, don't apologize for being in the, quote, ghetto. The ghetto isn't what you think. The ghetto is a museum. The ghetto is one of the most exciting things you can imagine. It's cultures coming and going. It's histories being played out. It's stories. It's delightful. Now, as a pastor, of course, it's troubling because 70% of my neighborhood came and went every year. I wonder how come our church didn't grow. We were reaching so many new people. I checked the local school down the street. 73% of the kids that entered there in the fall were gone in the spring. I suddenly realized I'm in this port of entry. I have to reach 5 people to keep 1. You need a kingdom theology. The church is not an end in itself. The church is a sign of and an agent for the kingdom of God. Unless you see this bigger picture, unless you see that the alien in your neighborhood may be Onesimus, running away from Asia, remember in the Paul story of Philemon? Maybe that refugee that's come to the city today is going to be the Billy Graham or the Mother Teresa of that country and culture tomorrow. The people who are coming to the city can be reached. A small church might have a handful of people. In the past, this has been largely an urban reality. But a few months ago, I preached in Decatur, Georgia, right next to the TBN headquarters. There were 55 flags hanging from the balcony of the church. They had invited me to see this because I had commented on a church in Florida a few years ago that had 34 flags hanging from the balcony because they had 34 nations in the membership. This church in Decatur, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta, has 55 nations in the membership of their church. There were 197 nations that came to Atlanta for the Olympic Games. 55 nations in one congregation in Decatur, Georgia. That illustrates what I'm trying to say. Suburbs are no longer the escape from the city. The suburbs are the extensions of the city. And the white fright realities that drove people out to the suburbs in the 60s, I have news for you. The people who are following you are not white. In fact, in that pricey upscale suburb called Bellevue, across Lake Washington, La Crosse, Mercer Island, that Bellevue, which is the heart of the Microsoft campus, we just saw the study a month or 2 ago. 30% of the children in the public system of Bellevue go home and speak a different language than English. 30% of the children go home to languages other than English. This is the modern suburb. It's a human zoo. A little mouse ran down my street in Chicago. It was an arrogant mouse, flaunting himself. All of a sudden there was a meow, and the mouse dove into a manhole cover. The cat reached down, couldn't quite get the mouse, just touched the top of the fur, just scratched the mouse a little bit, couldn't grab it. Mouse was in trouble because it couldn't get further down because water had filled up this manhole cover. All of a sudden there was a row, 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 and up went the paw and patter of little feet, and it was silent. Mouse said, whew. Cat chased the mouse away. He was feeling so good. Dog chased the cat away, and mouse clawed him up. He was looking around, and all of a sudden, whoop, it was a cat. He was about to eat the mouse. Mouse said, wait a minute, where's the dog? And the cat said, Mouse, if you're going to survive in the city, you got to be bilingual.